And so with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Allison. He's the Vice President of Science at the Bernice Buahi Bishop Museum in Honolulu, Hawaii. He's the former director of the Wau Ecology Institute in Morobe Province, Papua New Guinea, where he conducted scientific research in the 1970s and early 1980s. His research focuses on using information from museum collections and biological surveys to assist resource managers in developing conservation strategies. So with that, I'd like to introduce Allison.
Can everybody hear me? No. All right. At least you're awake. You know, those of us who study New Guinea, I think, do it out of a sense of adventure, amongst other things, and I think that, or at least I hope that we might motivate you to go there and share in that adventure. But if you're not able to do that, I strongly recommend United Airlines. They put me through quite an adventure yesterday and last night. I'm from the Bishop Museum, and just a little sort of propaganda on the museum. Founded in 1889, we've been going for some 115 years. Unlike the other large natural history museums in the United States, we specialize on a region, and that's the Pacific region. And if you just counted up the number of specimens we have, which is 24 million, that would make us the fourth largest museum in the United States. And that's a little picture of the main campus there. Let's see, Jack. Let's see. Great. Okay, here we are, the island of New Guinea. Stretches from 0 to 12 degrees south latitude over 20 degrees of longitude. As Jack mentioned, it's the highest and largest tropical island in the world. The dark green there represents lowlands, the lighter green upper elevations, and the brown the highest elevations. There's a map to my right here that you can see that. What I would like to highlight there is that this island represents less than half of 1% of the land area of the world. It has from 5 to 10% of the world's biological diversity. It has enormous cultural diversity as well. And by the way, I don't distinguish really. Biodiversity includes people. I want to be very clear about that. But looking at, if you want to break it down into cultural diversity, some 15% or more of the world's languages found on the island of New Guinea. Just to put that into perspective, that's as many indigenous languages as found in all of North and South America. New Guinea, as you can see there, is located right north of Australia. It's separated from Australia by a very shallow bit of water. That was a land connection just really literally a few thousand years ago. Is there a pointer? I didn't bring one. There is.
And there's the button there.
Wow. Okay. What I would like to do is draw your attention to these sorts of sets of trenches here that sort of come up through here and so forth. If you look at a map of the world broken into tectonic plates, I think many of you have heard about those. The Pacific is largely composed of one plate, the Pacific plate, and as you'll see, it runs pretty much straight through New Guinea. These little yellow dots there are earthquakes, and those represent movements at the plate boundaries. The Indo-Australian plate here is moving north. The Pacific plate is basically moving to the west, and that's causing tremendous uplift, and as well as many earthquakes. Just to put things into perspective, the island of New Guinea is probably around 25 million years ago. I mean, and it started out as a series of archipelagos that have coalesced. It's what we call a geological composite. It's made up of many little bits. There's 32 little bits that have either sort of rafted in or have been pushed up from the sea floor and so forth. And this has caused rapid uplift, but it also has caused a lot of landslides and so forth. And this just shows you the difference in one area between just a few years, less than a decade. It's estimated that 7% of the land area is at some stage of recovering from earthquakes, or landslides induced by earthquakes. Ecologically very, very rich. This is a map from the World Wildlife WWF that broke it into a series of ecoregions. Basically, you have wet tropical lowland forests here, a different set of but similar forests up here. Draw your attention to a bit of grassland or savanna down there. And what I'm going to do on this journey in the next few minutes is to take us basically from the coast to the highest mountains, just so you can kind of experience the full range of the island and meet some of the plants and animals and along the way and some of the people who have studied those plants and animals. So beginning from the bottom, the Great Barrier Reef extends into New Guinea. This is not a picture that shows vast diversity at the reef, but I wanted this one to show that you have reefs, you have surrounding forest, and that's what happens in the surrounding forest affects the reefs. So we can think of those as integral units. But starting at the sea and beginning to move up into the coast. Not all of the coastline, of course, is covered with reefs. You have many large rivers. Those put out fresh waters. Corals don't grow in those areas. And so we get these vast lowland wetlands. Now, if you go up those wetlands, you get into areas like this. The dark there are Nipa swamps. Those look something like that. The lighter areas here is sago. That's the tree along here. And if you get further up the river, you get into a little bit of drier forest with a different set of trees. It's a pretty daunting area to work in. These are some of its... Now, I must point out that I'm a herpetologist. I study amphibians and reptiles. I have the privilege of studying amphibians and reptiles, I might add. And it is, I think, as we all know, the premier group. And... But I do have a few token other animals in there just to appease my colleagues. In here, crocodiles. This is Crocodilus porosus. It's a large animal, occurs from the Solomons and parts even more distant than that, all the way up into towards India. And it's strongly conserved in some area, but these big individuals are becoming rarer and rare. Have other creatures. This is a mangrove monitor. It's related to the Komodo dragon. Interesting creature here. This is the pit-shelled turtle or so forth. It's a last surviving member of a group that has a fossil record throughout the world. But this one sole surviving species exists on the south coast of New Guinea and parts of northern Australia. This is a skink, one of the kinds of lizards that I studied, the emerald skink. Occurs in the trees. There are two groups, or besides the pit-shelled turtle or pig-nosed turtle, some people call it. There are a few other kinds of turtles, and they're different from the turtles that you may know from here. They have snake necks. They don't withdraw their necks straight back. They kind of bend them around, and that's kind of, you can see that by this person or that turtle there. As we get to up the rivers a little bit, as we travel up the rivers, you get into vast areas of lowland forest. This is the Kokori Basin. It's part of that low elevation that I showed you, the dark green in the southern part of New Guinea on the map, literally as far as the eye can see, just flat lowland forest. You can get up it through rivers and so forth. Some of it is relatively, is that in focus? I can't see from here. Some of that is relatively open, and you can make through the trees with lots of buttresses, lots of vines and so forth, fairly characteristic. Other bits of the forest are quite dense and hard to get to, and we often get up through the rivers and so forth to reach those areas. Many species of New Guinea plants don't have very showy flowers. These huge trees often have very small wind-pollinated flowers, so they're not much to look at. So I thought I'd show you a few of the showier plants. These are a couple of orchids from low elevations. New Guinea is rich in orchids, more than 3,500 species. It's one of the richest areas in the world for those. Most of animal life is small. Vertebrates like us, the amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals and fishes, comprise a very small fraction of animal life. Most of animal life are invertebrates, and this is just sort of a little sampling here of those. Mollusks, a very big group. Land snails are particularly common in forests in New Guinea that have limestone. This is as you might expect, called a leaf insect, related to walking sticks and actually distant related, or not terribly distantly related to cockroaches, actually. And this is a little animal called Peripatus that is it's in its own group, its own phylum, that sort of has features of both the arthropods, which insects are a member of, and mollusks that the snail is. So it's kind of a so-called missing link, if you want to call it that. Occurs in the leaf litter of rainforests. These are some of the creatures that I study. Let me introduce them to you. New Guinea is particularly rich in frogs. There are nearly 300 species known to science, and the total number is probably something on the order of 500. So even though there are lots of them and we know their names, there are lots of them that we don't know their names. This fellow here does not have a scientific name. The rest actually do. But many of the frogs, like this one, and this one, are what we call direct developers. They don't have a tadpole stage. They lay their eggs in moist areas. This one nests in tree cavities and so forth. He's just a little guy. He's only about an inch long, less than an inch long. And the male guards the eggs. And when the eggs hatch, the male often, but not always, carries the little froglets around. And this isn't the best picture, but you can see them attaching to the male there. And this is the same, these two are the same species, just to give you an idea. This guy here, which is you could call a wide-mouthed frog, but this is truly a wide-mouthed frog. You've probably heard that joke. But anyway, this one makes a nest of foam in the lowland forest in little puddles and lays the eggs in there. These are truly the most elegant of creatures, the lizards, which is what I mostly study. This, as you might expect, is a crocodile skink. It lives in rotting logs and so forth in the floors of lowland forests. There are many lizards in the trees. This is a gecko. Actually, it's a fairly widely distributed thing from the Solomon Islands all the way up into Palau, which is not all that far from Philippines. Geckos, many of you have heard that geckos lack eyelids. In fact, they do have eyelids, but they're fused and transparent, so their eyes are open all the time. This is a skink, same thing as that emerald skink, or same group as that emerald skink that I showed you earlier. This is an undescribed species, and actually I just got in from Washington, D.C., where we had a conference, and I stole a bit of time from the conference to meet with a colleague, and we've got a paper that's about, I guess, a fourth finished, describing this as a new species. It's from the south coast of New Guinea. When I say describing as a new species, we in science have a very formal process by which we look at an animal and we decide if it has a name or not. If it doesn't have a name, then we publish a paper. We designate a specimen called the holotype to carry the name of that species, and we deposit that specimen in a museum. And so that paper basically launches the name of that species. So some of these that I'm telling you, that's a work in process. Some of the other lizards, these are all monitor lizards related to the famous Komodo dragon. This one here you can see with a long tail, which is actually prehensile, is up in the trees. Very beautiful thing, emerald green. I don't know if this slide does it justice, but it's an extraordinarily beautiful animal. Very docile and friendly. This is a young thing of a thing called Varanus dorianus, or Dory's monitor. Very, very bright speckling and so forth. It's both in the trees and on the forest. And this guy here has the distinction, not this particular individual, but the species, as being the longest lizard in existence. They get up to more than 12 feet, probably upwards of 14 feet. And you might see a little bit of blood there. And he hasn't just bitten me or eaten somebody else. In fact, when they get upset, their gums bleed. And you might wonder why that is. Well, it turns out that they have peptides, small little protein fragments, that are identical to some of the venoms found in snakes. And in fact, this group of lizards is the group that we think is very closely related to snakes. And so if you get bitten by one of these things, despite the fact that this one here is at least 9 feet long, it'll do you some damage. Anyway, if those peptides get in there, you're in even more trouble. So watch it if you run into one of these. These are, most people love to hate snakes, but they're actually nice creatures. They do a lot of good. They range from little things that look like worms, called, interestingly enough, worm snakes, to big pythons. Here you see a young circus performer with that same individual. My daughter tells me that I had something called a mullet, which I'd never heard of, and so anyway, this one, when I first found it, I thought something that was brightly colored like this might be warning you that he's poisonous, but in fact that's not the case. It's a harmless water snake. This one is poisonous. This one is quite poisonous. It's what we call a sit-and-wait predator. It just sits very quietly on the forest floor and nabs lizards and other small animals as they go by. And I don't know of any of our scientific colleagues who have been bitten, but in many villages, the villagers will tell you about how dangerous it is. As some of you may have heard, that when people have been looking at the relationships of dinosaurs and so forth, and they've basically concluded that dinosaurs really never did go extinct, that birds are really simply just glorified reptiles. So I show you a picture of some glorified reptiles here. These are birds that are characteristic of the lowland forest. Others, I'm sure, are going to deal with birds in far more detail, but just to give you sort of a smattering of things, this is a hornbill, the Ragiana bird of paradise, photograph courtesy of Bruce Buehler, passed around through generations of biologists all over the world. The same photo, I think, Bruce. But Gurra pigeon, large, about the size of a turkey, one of the northern cassowary, beautiful, large, flightless bird. You can see how large they get in a minute. One of the many kingfishers, very bright, pretty birds, and this is the little kingbird of paradise. As many of you know, New Guinea is the world center for birds of paradise, except for a couple of species found in west of New Guinea and a few species found in Australia. All the world species are found only in New Guinea. Some of the lowland mammals. This is the spotted cuscus. This is one of the fruit bats. There are only 4 groups of mammals in New Guinea: the marsupials, the bats, and rats, and something called the monotremes, or egg-laying mammals, things related to the platypus in Australia. I'll show you those a bit later. The larger fruit-eating bats are called flying foxes, and you can kind of see that in the face of this thing. I did mention that the far south of the country is lowland savanna. It receives very limited rainfall, and so you get an open sort of forest, very similar to that in Australia. This is an escarpment outside the capital Papua New Guinea, Port Moresby, and just very open forest, getting into some closed forests on the top there. You get termite mounds, just as you do in Australia, and sort of a substory of grasses, and then a open woodland tree formation of eucalyptus and so forth. Sort of picture of that here. You do get, we don't have kangaroos in the strict sense, but we do have large wallabies. This is one here. So, and if you go to those areas, you find creatures like this. This is the famous frilly-necked lizard, which is found over much of this open woodland formation in northern Australia and occurs throughout the southern New Guinea and that savanna area. Another one of these, I keep showing these because these are the largest predatory animals in New Guinea. It's sort of back to in a sense like the dinosaurs. You have large reptiles that are the top predators. Interesting little thing here. This is not a snake. It's actually a lizard related to geckos. And this here is the taipan, photograph courtesy of Mark O'Shea, and arguably the most poisonous snake in the world. They're highly aggressive. They have a lot of venom, and that venom is very toxic. So it's a very aggressive snake. It will chase you. So that's always an interesting moment. As we move up the slopes a bit, what I'm going to do is take you up to the mountains, to the very tops. As we get up the mountains a bit, we run into, and this is the town of Wow, where I and many of our biological colleagues here spent, shall we say it, their formative years. And former gold mining area. Gold was discovered here in 1922, and these open cuts relate to mines. This is Mount Kaindi, where a lot of us worked, and down in here, right over in here, is the Wow Ecology Institute. It was a former field station of the Bishop Museum where I did my field work for my PhD. Bruce Beeler worked there, Thane Pratt worked there, as well as Steve Pruitt-Jones and a number of others. As you go up the slope, you begin to get sort of a more open forest formation. The trees are still often buttressed, at least at the lower ranges of this, and I'm talking about 1,000 feet to maybe 1,800 feet is sort of in this zone. These trees here, the ones sticking way up there, are araucarias. It's an interesting group of tree. You might know them as a monkey puzzle tree or something like that. There's a couple of species in South America. There's a few related forms in New Zealand, a bunch of related species in New Caledonia, a few in Australia, and it represents a connection between South America, Antarctica, and Australia in many, many years ago. It's a very ancient group of conifers. This is agathis, which is a very important timber tree in New Zealand and so forth, and is found in nearly pure stands in parts of New Guinea. So you're beginning to get sort of a change in forest type. Trees that you might be familiar with. This is quite obviously an oak tree. They form trees, I don't know, about upwards of 100 feet high in the forests at this sort of mid-elevation area. These are amorous weevils. There are many. There's probably upwards of 1 million species of insects in New Guinea, and these are obviously weevils in love. And I just want to emphasize that there's no sex like insects. You begin to get some different plants. This is an orchid that actually does occur in lower elevations all the way up. Phaeus tinkervillii, but you begin to get some of the rhododendrons. New Guinea has some 300 species of rhododendrons, so it's as you get, most of them are higher, mid-elevation to higher elevation things. This one, Rhododendron erigeranum, is a thing that's found in open grasslands and so forth at mid-elevations. Some of the frogs that occur in those areas. This is a tree frog, probably an undescribed species. This is a frog that digs burrows in the ground and calls from there, maddening to find. This little guy is a guy we described as a new species about 2-3 years ago. Notice his long nose. We called him Longirostris, which means long nose. Neat little guy. Some of the lizards, try to move along here a little bit. Just some of the skinks, so forth. This is an angle-headed lizard related to the frilly neck. Some of the snakes, I call these upland snakes. As you get up to higher elevations, snakes begin to disappear. They're built fairly low to the ground, and as temperatures get cooler, they disappear. But this is the so-called brown tree snake. Some of you may have heard of it. It's basically the snake that ate Guam because it got introduced there during the war, and it's eaten all the native birds to extinction. This is something called the small-eyed snake. You'd be hard-pressed to get your hand around a large one, very large snake, not terribly aggressive unless they're provoked, but often found in upland forests. Vulturine parrot, it's a fruit-eating bird, a very good indicator of a good pristine forest. They tend to disappear quickly if there's any high level of hunting pressure. Calls incessantly and very annoyingly in the early morning. You can't miss them. Interesting mammals, kangaroos that don't, when you look at them, impress you as being very bright, but they are built to climb trees. They're not terribly good at it, but they can do it. Some of the other mammals, these are what are called possums or cuscus, and this is a thing called a ringtail. Both these groups are well represented in Australia, occur at various elevations in Guinea. Some of the other groups of mammals, this is a rat. This is a group of rats that's a subfamily that's largely restricted to the New Guinea region. A bandicoot, sort of think of that as a marsupial rabbit. This is sort of a marsupial shrew. These are carnivorous marsupials. This is, you could think of as a marsupial cat. It's related to the Tasmanian devil, quite a voracious predator, about the size of a house cat, and a little thing called a sugar glider, which you could think of as very similar to our flying squirrel here. So how do we get to these areas? Well, we go to the store in a developed area that we can fly into, and we buy a lot of stuff, and we put that on a plane, and we take it to some remote place, and we hire a bunch of people, and we take it to high elevations. So here we are at the airstrip looking up at the top of here, and we've got to take all of that equipment all the way up there, which is, we use standard technology, which is to carry it up. On this particular expedition, we had 125 people carrying equipment up there. We moved big boxes of stuff that had sensitive equipment in there. We moved liquid nitrogen for collecting tissue samples for DNA. Took 4 people to carry this, 2 at a time, and then the 2 rested and the other 2 took over. Where we can, we get roads. They're not always good roads, but I got out here and let the driver drive across. Sorry. That was just a, I guess I could go. No, I've done it. Where we can get access to large water courses, we do. This is a lake that we got across. This is Andy Mack, if you know him, and Deb Wright in younger days. And this is how I got off of the island of Woodlark, which is far off the northeastern coast of New Guinea, with 125 of my closest friends. And we spent 4 days on this boat, and when I sent this picture to my wife, she said, "I asked you to do nothing stupid," and I said, "I didn't," and she said, "This looks stupid." And then I convinced her that I really had it all under control, that I had my pockets filled with plastic bags, and when the boat capsized, I could float. And that convinced her that I was stupid. Anyway, and where possible, of course, we get into helicopters. Camp life is fairly standard. We build shelters out of bush materials. We cover them with plastic. Our local field assistants and so forth, when they can, go out hunting. This is somebody carrying a pig, somebody who nabbed a cassowary, and we eat that. But mostly we eat canned fish and meat. It's kind of similar to dog food. When you get up to higher elevations, the trees become very mossed, lower in stature. This is the famous Nothofagus that has a similar distribution to the Araucaria that I mentioned earlier. These trees, although they don't look like it, are conifers, and they tend to dominate at the higher elevations. Some of the plants, these are rhododendrons here. This is an orchid. This is vaccinium, a relative of blueberry, huckleberry, those sorts of things. This is a rhododendron here with a curved flower like that, pollinated by birds, and there's one in the act. This is a bowerbird. He builds a pole of twigs and sort of patrols that as a display area. Some of the mammals, this is the echidna that I mentioned earlier. It's an egg-laying mammal. Its protection is very slow-moving, protected with spines. Sticks this snout in the ground and sucks up earthworms as you might spaghetti. Some of the denizens of the higher elevation forest, the montane forests, and here we're talking about upwards of 8 to 9, 10,000 feet. Some of the frogs, you can see this is a little guy only about half an inch long with a big voice. Interestingly enough, you find a snake up there. This is Boland's python, a very valuable snake that goes upwards of, 10 or 12 feet, and very sought after in the snake trade. This is a insect, interesting, has little pits on its back. Lichen grows in those pits, and as do a few other primitive plants. And you have various protozoans and other small little animals living there in that. Here's a thing called an ant plant, related to the coffee family, has this expanded base, occurs as epiphytes on trees. That has these big chambers. At lower elevations, you have ants in these. Above about 9,000 feet, no ants, but the frogs get in there, and they make their home in there, laying their eggs. What? 2 minutes. Okay, we'll zoom through here. You get to the higher mountains. This is getting upwards of about 10,000 feet up in there, so you can kind of see a transect here. As you get up there, you get a sort of a shrubland with a mosaic of grassland, and you look at that in a different way. You've got sort of a large valley here with grassland with some shrubland on the sides. Kind of looks like it might even be here somewhere in the Rockies. Grassland in the bottoms of the valleys because cold air wells up there. Here's another view of what that looks like. As you get higher, this is on Mount Wilhelm, you're approaching, here it's about 13,000 something feet. As you get even higher, this is the summit area of Punjak Jaya, the highest mountain. You're getting into permanent glaciers. It's just another view of that. Some of the creatures that occur there aren't many. These are frogs that live in moss, new species of lizard that we were just describing. Some of the plants that occur in those areas are plants that you have around here that you might know. Violets, pearly everlasting, these are gentians. These are buttercups, ranunculus, cinquefoils, here potentilla. So as you get up to these high elevations, you get into that. A little bit about conservation. Some 60% of New Guinea still has original forest, but it is receding fast. It's for agriculture for something like oil palm, which produces something like this. Land clearing for settlement and logging, which I'm not going to show. Others are going to deal with conservation. I've been working in New Guinea for 30 years, and you might wonder how I started there, and obviously as a small kid, it looks like. And here we are on Mount Wilhelm 30 years ago. Getting a bit older here. This is about 15 years later. Andy Mack here, Deb right there. Harry Sakulis, who was director of the WOW Ecology. A little bit later here, about, nearly 8 years after that, knee pads now, and with Bruce Beeler. Here, this is in New Ireland. Work closely with the local people. Their knowledge is extraordinary, and it's important to work closely with them. Most of the biologists that I know, including myself, on a scale of 0 to 10 in terms of our biological field ability, I would put it 2 or 3 compared to these guys at 8 or 10. They're just extraordinary people, and to work with them is truly a privilege. They know so much more about the forest than I'll ever know. Thank you very much.